What if I told you that one of the most infamous witch hunts in history didn't begin with dark spells, broomsticks, or satanic rituals, but with a group of young girls, a town drowning in paranoia, and a society ready to turn on itself? Salem in 1692 wasn't just about witches. It was about fear weaponized, lies given power, and justice transformed into murder. The story you think you know, the one of innocent women burned at the stake, is already a twisted myth. No one in Salem was burned. The truth is stranger, darker, and far more disturbing. Because behind the gallows and courtrooms was a community unraveling, using witchcraft as an excuse to settle scores, seize land, and feed its own hysteria. And the most chilling part? It all began inside a minister's home, with two girls who couldn't stop screaming. To understand the nightmare that would consume Salem, you first need to picture the town itself. Salem Village, Massachusetts, in 1692 wasn't the bustling, historic site tourists visit today. It was a small Puritan settlement on the edge of wilderness, cold, isolated, and ruled by strict religious doctrine. For the Puritans, life was a constant battle between God and the devil. Every crop failure, every disease, every argument could be blamed on Satan's influence. The people were poor. Many families lived in fear of starvation. Native American raids were a constant threat on the frontier. Epidemics swept through without warning. And looming over all of it was a rigid religious system that demanded purity and punished deviation. This was not a place of tolerance or forgiveness. This was a place where sin was policed, neighbors spied on one another, and different was dangerous. Salem wasn't just a town. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark came in the winter of 1692. Reverend Samuel Parris was Salem Village's minister, a man already disliked by many for his greed and paranoia. Inside his household, his 9-year-old daughter Betty and his 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams began to exhibit bizarre behavior. They screamed uncontrollably, threw themselves onto the floor in violent fits, claimed invisible forces were pinching or choking them. Their bodies twisted unnaturally, as if something unseen were controlling them. Soon, other girls in Salem began to show the same symptoms. And Putnam, Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, all young, all suddenly afflicted. What was happening? Were these seizures caused by illness, ergot poisoning from moldy rye, psychological stress, or, as the community quickly believed, witchcraft? The Puritan worldview left little room for doubt. If children were suffering in ways medicine couldn't explain, the devil had to be at work. And if the devil was present, someone in Salem was helping him. Under pressure to explain themselves, the girls named names. Their first targets were 3 women who fit Salem's idea of outsiders. Tituba, Reverend Parris's enslaved servant from the Caribbean, whose difference in skin color and culture made her an easy scapegoat. Sarah Good, a poor, homeless beggar woman despised for her sharp tongue. Sarah Osborne, an older woman who had scandalized the village by refusing to attend church regularly. When questioned, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne denied everything. But Tituba broke. Whether out of fear, coercion, or strategy, she confessed. And not just to witchcraft, but to serving the devil himself. She described black dogs, red cats, a yellow bird, and even a man who told her to hurt the children. Her confession wasn't just an admission, it was a spark poured onto dry kindling. Because if one witch existed in Salem, surely there were more. What followed was hysteria, unlike anything colonial America had ever seen. Once the first accusations were made, the afflicted girls began naming more and more supposed witches. Each new name created more fear, which led to more accusations, which led to more arrests. And here's the chilling truth. In Salem, accusation was power. If you accused someone else, suspicion shifted away from you. If your enemy was accused, you could seize their land or inheritance. If you were accused, your only hope was to confess and point the finger at others. This wasn't justice. It was a cycle of survival where lies became weapons. Salem's court system fanned the flames, accepting spectral evidence, testimony that a person has spirit or ghost had appeared to torment the victim. No physical proof was required. If someone said they saw your ghost in their dream, it could condemn you to death. By spring of 1692, Salem was devouring itself. Neighbors accused neighbors. Families accused relatives. Prominent citizens people once considered untouchable were dragged into the frenzy. Martha Corey, respected and deeply religious, was accused. Rebecca Nurse, a grandmother admired for her piety, was accused. Even former ministers were accused. The trials became public spectacles. Courtrooms overflowed with townspeople, eager to watch the drama unfold. Each convulsion, each scream from the afflicted girls was treated as proof that the accused were guilty. By summer, the executions began. Bridget Bishop, the first to be tried, was found guilty and hanged in June. Her crime? Owning clothes that were considered too fancy and being a woman who spoke her mind. She wasn't a witch. She was simply inconvenient. As the noose tightened around Salem, fear turned into murder sanctioned by law. In total, 19 people were hanged on Gallows Hill. One man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death with heavy stones because he refused to enter a plea. His last words, legend says, were more weight. Others died in filthy jails, starving or freezing while awaiting trial. And yet, through all of this, not a single witch was ever found. No spell books, no cauldrons, no evidence. Only fear, rumor, and the manipulations of a community in collapse. But here's where the story takes its darkest turn. Because behind the screams of the girls and the gallows on the hill were hidden motives, land disputes, political rivalries, and religious power plays. Salem's witch trials weren't really about witches at all. They were about control. In part 2, we'll pull back the curtain and expose the twisted agendas that turned neighbor against neighbor, and how some families used witchcraft accusations as a weapon to wipe out their rivals. By now, Salem was no longer just a quiet Puritan settlement. It had become a stage for paranoia, a courtroom where lies had the power to kill, and a battlefield where old grudges were disguised as piety. The witch trials were never only about young girls seeing visions or accusing neighbors. They were about power, property, and the brutal machinery of fear. If part 1 revealed how hysteria began, part 2 exposes how the hysteria was exploited. Because while the gallows stood tall, many in Salem quietly sharpened their knives, not to fight the devil, but to take down their rivals. To grasp the twisted truth, we need to remember that Salem Village was not united. There were two factions. The Putnam family and their allies fiercely traditional, deeply religious, supportive of Reverend Samuel Parris, and resentful of Salem town's growing wealth. The Porter family and their supporters wealthier, more commercially minded, and skeptical of Parris's rigid leadership. This divide wasn't just ideological, it was personal. The Putnams and Porters fought over church appointments, land boundaries, and local governance. Salem was a community at war with itself, long before witchcraft entered the picture. So when accusations began to fly, who do you think ended up on the chopping block? The enemies of the accusers. And the Putnams, especially young Ann Putnam Jr. and her family, became some of the most prolific accusers in Salem. The witch trials turned accusation into a weapon. Take Rebecca Nurse. At 71 years old, she was one of the most respected members of the community. But she was also caught in a bitter land dispute with the Putnams. When Ann Putnam Jr. and other afflicted girls suddenly claimed Rebecca's spirit tormented them, suspicion spread like wildfire. At first, many villagers defended Rebecca. Even the governor's wife signed a petition on her behalf. But the court, eager to prove its authority, chose to believe the children. Rebecca was convicted and hanged in July 1692. Her death wasn't about witchcraft. It was about silencing a rival family. And she wasn't the only one. Martha Corey, another respected woman, openly criticized the trials, calling them nonsense. For speaking out, she too was accused, convicted, and executed. The message was clear. Resist the hysteria, and you'll be branded a witch. Salem's witch trials weren't random mob justice. They were institutionalized by law. In May 1692, Governor William Phips established a special court called the Court of Oyer and Terminer, meaning to hear and determine. Its judges included some of the most powerful men in Massachusetts. But this court was unlike any you'd recognize today. Spectral evidence testimony that the accused spirit appeared to harm someone was admissible. The afflicted girls were treated as victims and holy witnesses, never as liars or manipulators. The accused had almost no chance to defend themselves. Imagine standing trial where your neighbor could say, "Her ghost appeared in my room last night and tried to choke me." No proof, no witnesses, just words. And those words could kill you. Between June and September, this court sentenced dozens of people to death. Each execution only validated the system further, creating a sickening loop. The more witches they killed, the more proof they believed they had that witches existed. One of the darkest twists of Salem was the way confessions worked. If you denied being a witch, you were often hanged. If you confessed, however, you might be spared, but only if you named others. This meant the safest path was to lie, to admit to impossible crimes, and to feed the court more names. The more names you gave, the more the hysteria spread. It's a cruel irony. Truth led to death, while lies kept you alive. Salem rewarded deceit and punished integrity. Perhaps no story captures Salem's cruelty better than that of Giles Corey. Corey was an 81-year-old farmer who refused to enter a plea when accused of witchcraft. His reason was strategic. By not pleading guilty or not guilty, he could prevent the court from seizing his land from his heirs. The court responded with peine forte et dure, pressing him under heavy stones until he would enter a plea. For 2 agonizing days, Corey was crushed as more weight was piled upon him. His legendary final words were, "More weight." He died not as a witch, but as a man resisting a corrupt system that demanded submission. His courage preserved his estate for his family, but his death revealed just how far Salem's leaders would go to enforce their authority. We can't forget the spiritual climate that fueled all of this. The Puritans believed the devil was as real as God, lurking around every corner, waiting to corrupt souls. Ministers preached fiery sermons, warning of hellfire and Satan's army. In this worldview, witches weren't fantasy. They were soldiers of Satan living among them. Reverend Cotton Mather, a prominent Boston minister, urged vigilance against witchcraft, but also cautioned against relying solely on spectral evidence. His words were twisted, used selectively, and his reputation later stained by the trials. Meanwhile, Reverend Samuel Parris of Salem fanned the flames. From his pulpit, he painted the village as under siege by evil. His sermons justified the court's actions and made resistance seem like betrayal of God. Religion, instead of offering comfort, became the weapon that justified injustice. By midsummer, the hysteria expanded beyond Salem village. Nearby towns saw their own residents accused. Prominent figures like George Burroughs, a former Salem minister, were charged. Burroughs's case was particularly disturbing. He was accused of extraordinary strength and leading a satanic conspiracy. At his execution, he shocked the crowd by flawlessly reciting the Lord's Prayer, a feat believed impossible for a witch. For a moment, it seemed the crowd might stop the hanging. But the judges pressed forward, and Burroughs was killed. This showed just how unstoppable the machinery of fear had become. Even miracles weren't enough to save the accused. Throughout all of this, one question lingers. Why didn't more people stand up against the madness? Some were simply afraid knowing resistance meant accusation. Others saw opportunity. Land belonging to the condemned could be seized, debts erased, and enemies eliminated. Salem's trials created winners and losers, and many profited from the bloodshed. It wasn't just fear. It was greed, ambition, and survival instinct wrapped in religious zeal. By the fall of 1692, cracks began to form in the hysteria. The number of accused grew so large that even prominent citizens and relatives of judges were implicated. When Governor Phipps's own wife was named, suddenly the trials seemed less divine and more dangerous. Skepticism grew. Ministers like Increase Mather, Cotton's father, declared that it was better that 10 suspected witches should escape and one innocent person be condemned. The machinery of fear began to slow, but not before dozens had been executed or left to rot in prison. The Salem Witch Trials weren't just a tragedy of hysteria. They were a mirror of humanity's darkest impulses. Fear, greed, power, and blind faith collided to create a nightmare that consumed an entire community. But what happened when the hysteria finally ended? How did Salem live with the shame, the guilt, and the twisted legacy of its witch hunt? In Part 3, we'll explore the aftermath, the confessions, the apologies, the long struggle for justice, and how Salem's dark chapter still haunts our culture today. By autumn of 1692, the once quiet Puritan settlement of Salem had become a place of mass graves, haunted consciences, and broken families. What began as a handful of girls accusing their neighbors had spiraled into one of the darkest legal tragedies in American history. But the horror didn't vanish overnight. The end of the witch trials left scars that lingered for generations and a legacy that still shapes how we think about justice, fear, and human cruelty today. By October 1692, skepticism had reached a breaking point. Too many accusations, too many respected citizens dead, and whispers that the devil's servants seemed suspiciously wealthy, well-connected, or inconvenient rivals. The tipping point came when Governor William Phipps's wife was accused of witchcraft. Suddenly, the hysteria was no longer an abstract danger. It threatened the colony's elite. Phipps moved swiftly, dissolving the court of Oyer and Terminer on October 29th, but the damage had already been done. 19 people hanged. 1 man pressed to death. 5 dead in prison. Over 150 accused. The machinery of fear sputtered to a halt, but the silence in Salem was deafening. For the survivors, life was not the same. Families of the condemned were left destitute, their land seized, their names stained. Widows struggled to remarry. Children grew up branded as sons or daughters of witches, and neighbors avoided them out of shame or lingering suspicion. Even those who confessed weren't free. They carried the burden of lies they had told to save their lives. Many never truly escaped the guilt of pointing fingers at friends and kin. Salem itself was fractured. The trials had not just executed individuals. They had executed trust. Families were divided, churches splintered, and the community lived under the shadow of what it had done. Almost immediately, questions began to surface. Had the courts been misled? Had innocent lives been destroyed? In January 1697, the Massachusetts General Court declared a day of fasting and repentance for the tragedy of Salem. That same year, Samuel Sewall, one of the trial's judges, stood before his congregation and confessed publicly that he had fallen into the guilt of innocent blood. He begged God's forgiveness. This was extraordinary, one of the few moments in history where a man in power admitted his role in mass injustice. But Sewall was an exception. Many others remained silent or justified their actions until the end of their lives. And what about the girls? Years later, in 1706, Anne Putnam Jr., one of the most prominent accusers, stood before her church and issued a remarkable apology. She admitted she had been deluded by Satan and had caused the shedding of innocent blood. She sought forgiveness from the families of those she had accused. But was it sincerity or survival? By then, Salem had shifted. The winds of faith and fear had turned. To remain a respected member of society, Anne had to seek redemption. Whether her apology healed or reopened wounds is a question history can never fully answer. For decades, the families of the condemned fought for restitution. Slowly, Massachusetts began to offer compensation. In 1711, the colony passed a bill restoring the names of many of the accused and granted some financial reparations to their heirs. But money could not erase memory. A few pounds of silver could not bring back mothers, fathers, sons, or daughters. The stain of Salem remained. Even into the 20th century, efforts to clear the names of the last condemned continued. It wasn't until 1957, over 260 years later, that Massachusetts formally apologized for the trials. And it wasn't until 2001 that the final names were legally exonerated. Think about that. It took 3 centuries to fully admit the truth. The Salem Witch Trials didn't vanish into dusty court records. They became legend. They became warning. Writers like Nathaniel Hawthorne, whose own ancestor had been a judge at the trials, wove Salem's guilt into works like The Scarlet Letter and The House of the Seven Gables. Arthur Miller later resurrected Salem's story in The Crucible, a play written not about witches, but about McCarthyism, the 1950s Red Scare, and the dangers of political hysteria. Salem became more than a town. It became a metaphor, a symbol of what happens when fear rules, when justice collapses, when neighbors turn on each other under the illusion of righteousness. You might ask, why should we care about events from over 300 years ago? Because Salem isn't just history. It's a mirror. Every society faces moments of fear. Sometimes it's fear of witches, sometimes communists, sometimes the other. And when fear mixes with power, justice is always at risk. The Salem Witch Trials remind us of the fragility of truth, the dangers of blind faith, and the cost of letting hysteria go unchallenged. They warn us that fear can make ordinary people do monstrous things. At the heart of it, Salem wasn't just about witches. It was about people. Greedy people, fearful people, ambitious people. The devil may have been invisible, but the real evil was very human. In the end, Salem teaches us that the scariest monsters don't wear horns or ride broomsticks. They sit in pews, wear judges' robes, and live next door. As we look back on the Salem Witch Trials, we are not just remembering a tragedy, we are confronting a question. What would we have done if we lived there? Would we have spoken out, or stayed silent, accused, or defended? And perhaps the most haunting truth is this: Salem is not unique. It is a story that can and has repeated itself whenever fear outweighs reason. The Salem Witch Trials remind us not only of what happened then, but of what could happen again.